If you grew up in Ontario, you know the ritual. You load the empties into the trunk, drive to a low, windowless beige building, and hand your bottles to a person behind a counter who's seen it all. For almost 100 years, if you wanted a case of beer in this province, this was basically your only option. A strange, foreign-owned monopoly hiding in plain sight, blessed by the government and quietly collecting billions. Nobody chose the beer store. The beer store was simply there, the way the weather is there. But in the last 2 years, something that was supposed to be permanent started to crack. Corner stores got beer. Grocery stores got beer. And the beige building on the edge of town suddenly had to answer a question it had avoided for 90 years. What are you actually for? This is the story of how Ontario's most quietly powerful retailer is being dismantled and why almost nobody is sad to see it go. Let's start with something that every Ontario adult understands on a bone-deep level, even if they've never thought to question it. For the better part of a century, buying a case of beer in this province was a uniquely strange experience. You didn't go to a supermarket. You didn't grab a six-pack at the corner store the way people in literally every other jurisdiction in North America did. You drove to a specific building, usually squat, usually beige, usually located in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a discount mattress outlet, and you did your shopping through a counter or a wall of refrigerator doors. You took a number. You waited. Someone brought your case out on a dolly. It operated less like a retail store and more like a government service depot. The selection was the selection. The hours were the hours. The prices were the prices. There was no negotiation, no browsing, no atmosphere to speak of. Just beer, a fluorescent ceiling, and the faint smell of cardboard. And for generations of Ontarians, this was completely normal. This was just how it worked. The reason it worked this way, the reason it had to work this way was that the beer store wasn't really a store at all. It was a government-sanctioned distribution monopoly operating under a legal framework that made it, for all practical purposes, the only game in town for beer sales in Ontario. And the entity that controlled this monopoly, it wasn't a crown corporation. It wasn't a Canadian company protecting local jobs. It was a consortium of 3 of the world's largest multinational brewing corporations operating a private cartel inside a public monopoly, collecting a toll on every case of beer sold in the province. For 97 years. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to 1927. The year is important. Ontario had just emerged from a brutal experiment with prohibition, which ran from 1916 to 1927, longer than the American version. The province had watched the temperance movement attempt to legislate alcohol out of existence, watched it fail spectacularly, and was now trying to figure out how to reintroduce beer sales without triggering the same social chaos that had motivated the ban in the first place. The answer the government landed on was control, not a free market, but a tightly managed distribution system where the government could monitor volume, tax the product, and theoretically limit access. The entity created to manage this was called the Brewers Retail, a cooperative body run by the breweries themselves. The logic, at the time, was almost sensible. The brewers had the infrastructure to distribute their own product. The government could regulate the system from the outside. It was a partnership born of pragmatism. What nobody fully appreciated in 1927 was what would happen over the following decades as Canadian brewing consolidated into fewer and fewer hands. By the 1990s, the Canadian beer industry had effectively been absorbed into 3 global giants. Molson had merged with Coors to become Molson Coors, an American-Canadian hybrid headquartered partly in Denver, Colorado. Labatt had been purchased outright by Interbrew, a Belgian company that would eventually become AB InBev, the largest beer conglomerate on the planet. And Sleeman, the third player, had been acquired by Sapporo of Japan. Think about what this means. The entity running Ontario's beer distribution network, the one that controlled where beer could be sold, what prices were charged, and which products could even access the shelf, was now legally owned by corporations based in Colorado, Belgium, and Tokyo. 3 foreign multinationals were operating a government-blessed monopoly on the retail sale of alcohol in Canada's most populous province. They were collecting fees from every competing brewer that wanted to sell product through their system, and the revenue was staggering. This was not a secret. It was simply never questioned loudly enough for anyone to do anything about it. In 2015, the government of Ontario did something that looked, on the surface, like progress. They announced that wine would be sold in grocery stores. For Ontarians who had spent years watching visitors from Quebec or British Columbia stare in disbelief at the concept of a beer monopoly, this felt like a long overdue crack in the wall. But buried inside the announcement was a deal that would extend the beer store's operational monopoly until 2025. It was called the Master Framework Agreement, an arrangement negotiated between the Ontario government and the 3 foreign brewers that locked in their control of beer distribution in exchange for allowing grocery stores to sell wine. The province essentially traded one partial liberalization for a decade-long extension of the core cartel. When Ontarians actually read what was in the agreement, the reaction was not polite. The public backlash to the Master Framework Agreement was visceral in a way that surprised even the people generating it. Here was the government of Ontario in 2015, actively signing a legal document that guaranteed a consortium of foreign multinationals would retain exclusive control over beer retail in the province until 2025. The deal even included a compensation clause, meaning if a future government tried to break the monopoly early, it would have to pay the beer store's corporate owners hundreds of millions of dollars in damages. The province had effectively made it legally and financially painful to give Ontarians what people in every other province already had. The optics were catastrophic, and the anger was bipartisan. Conservatives hated it because it was anti-competitive and protected a foreign cartel from market forces. Progressives hated it because it was a sweetheart deal for multinational corporations dressed up as consumer protection. Small independent craft brewers hated it because the beer store system charged them listing fees just to access the shelf, meaning the owners of the distribution network were extracting rent from the very competitors trying to break their dominance. For a decade, that anger simmered. And then, in 2023 and 2024, it finally boiled over. Before we get into what the collapse actually looked like, drop a comment right now telling me which Canadian industry you think is running the same playbook as the beer store. Because there are more of them than you'd think. And if you're new here, and this kind of deep dive into Canadian business is what you're into, hit subscribe. We do this every week. The government that eventually pulled the trigger on the beer store's monopoly was the Ford Conservatives, which is historically ironic, given that conservative governments had spent decades defending the system on free market grounds while completely ignoring the fact that it was, by definition, the opposite of a free market. In 2023, Ontario announced that convenience stores would be allowed to sell beer and wine. The rollout was phased, but the direction was clear. By the end of 2024, tens of thousands of retail locations across the province, corner stores, gas stations, grocery chains, had access to beer sales that had been legally restricted to the beer store and the LCBO for nearly a century. The effect on the beer store's volume was immediate and severe. When you've been the only option for 90 years, you don't actually know how to compete. Your locations were chosen for distribution efficiency, not customer convenience. Your hours were set by negotiation with the provincial government, not by what consumers actually wanted. Your product range was curated by the brewers who owned you, not by what the market demanded. Your entire operational model was built on the assumption that customers had no alternative. The moment they did, they left. Foot traffic collapsed. The casual convenience purchase, someone stopping for a six-pack on the way home from work, evaporated almost entirely. Why would anyone drive to a standalone beer store when the corner store on their street now had the same product? The beer store's only remaining advantage was selection and volume. If you wanted an obscure import or a full case of a craft lager, it was still often the better option. But that audience is a fraction of the mass market that had been captive for a century. The financial consequences were swift. The beer store began announcing store closures in 2024, locations that had operated for decades, in some cases, simply shutting down because the volume no longer justified the overhead. The company, which is not publicly traded and therefore not required to publish detailed financial disclosures, has been characteristically quiet about the scale of the collapse. But industry analysts and local reporting have painted a consistent picture of an organization in structural retreat. This is what happens when a monopoly loses its mandate. The business wasn't built to survive competition. It was built to prevent it. One of the most revealing chapters in the beer store's unraveling wasn't the store closures or the volume decline. It was the negotiation over what the foreign owners were owed. Remember the Master Framework Agreement's compensation clause? When the Ford government announced the expansion of convenience store beer sales, it triggered a legal and financial process that the province had known was coming. The three multinational brewing corporations that owned the beer store, Molson Coors, AB InBev, and Sapporo, were legally entitled to compensation for the early erosion of their market position. The Ontario government ultimately negotiated a settlement. The exact terms have not been fully disclosed, but the principle is extraordinary when you state it plainly. Ontario taxpayers effectively paid foreign corporations for the right to buy beer at a corner store. The government had to financially compensate the owners of a cartel for dismantling that cartel. The compensation wasn't punishment for wrongdoing. It was a contractual obligation the province had voluntarily entered into in 2015 when it signed the agreement. This is the kind of detail that gets buried in political announcements because it's too uncomfortable for anyone involved to highlight. The Ford government wanted to take credit for liberalizing beer sales. The beer companies wanted to extract as much value as possible from a monopoly that was clearly ending. The public just wanted to buy a six-pack at 7-Eleven. Nobody had an incentive to dwell on the fact that the province was writing a large check to foreign multinationals as the price of doing something that should have happened decades earlier. It is, in microcosm, a perfect illustration of how government-protected monopolies operate. They extract value while they exist. They extract value when they end. The only party that pays at every stage is the consumers. Here is the genuinely interesting question at the center of the beer store's future, and it has nothing to do with beer. The beer store operates the most comprehensive beverage container recycling program in North America. That is not marketing language. By measurable metrics, return rates, diversion from landfill, percentage of containers recovered, Ontario's deposit refund system, administered through the beer store, outperforms virtually every comparable program on the continent. The return rate for beer bottles in Ontario has historically hovered around 95 to 97%. In states and provinces with curbside-only recycling, the equivalent figure often sits below 50%. This recycling infrastructure is the one genuinely defensible thing the beer store does that the free market hasn't replaced, and it has become the organization's last argument for continued existence. As beer sales at beer store locations collapse, the recycling function remains. People still return empties. The machines still process them. The deposit system still incentivizes return. But the logic that justified attaching a distribution monopoly to a recycling program, the argument that you needed the same entity to do both, has always been dubious. Quebec separates its deposit return system from retail sales entirely. Other jurisdictions have found ways to maintain high return rates without requiring a captive retail monopoly to anchor the system. The beer store's parent companies understand this. The recycling operation is valuable. It generates revenue through processing fees and commodity sales of recovered glass and aluminum. It provides political cover. It's much harder for a government to look like it's killing a beloved recycling program than to dismantle a foreign-owned cartel. And it gives the beer store a reason to keep locations open even as beer sales volume continues to decline. What is quietly happening, and what almost nobody is saying out loud, is that the beer store is in the process of transforming itself from a beer retailer into a recycling depot that also sells beer. The core business is moving in reverse. The legacy function, the one bolted on almost as an afterthought, is becoming the reason the organization survives at all. This is a strange, kind of corporate rebirth, or possibly a very long, very slow death dressed up as adaptation. The honest answer is that nobody knows yet, including the people running it. Pull back from the specific story of the beer store, and the pattern becomes familiar. Canadian retail history is littered with entities that confused captivity with loyalty. Future Shop confused market dominance with competitive strength, right up until Best Buy bought them and quietly erased them. Tim Hortons confused cultural identity with business fundamentals, right up until a Brazilian private equity firm reduced the franchise to a cost-cutting exercise. Pizza confused ubiquity with value, right up until better-funded American competitors started showing up with faster service and lower prices. The beer store is a version of the same story, but with one crucial difference: it had a government guarantee that the others didn't. It wasn't just dominant. It was legally protected from competition. And that protection, paradoxically, made the eventual collapse far more complete than it would have been under normal market conditions. Because when you've never had to compete, you don't know how. When the protection disappears, there's no muscle memory for the fight. the deeper story here isn't about beer. It's about how governments in Canada have, for a long time, confused protecting industries with protecting consumers. They are not the same thing. Protecting a foreign-owned beer cartel for 97 years was never about keeping Ontario's beer affordable or ensuring its beer supply was secure. It was about maintaining a system that generated stable, predictable tax revenue, minimized the government's own administrative burden, and avoided the political cost of dismantling something old. The consumers were, at every stage, an afterthought. What's genuinely different about the 2024 and 2025 liberalization isn't just that corner stores can sell beer. It's that it happened at all. Canadian governments don't typically dismantle entrenched, politically connected monopolies. The fact that this one is being dismantled, even slowly, even with a compensation check to the foreign corporations, even with all the political awkwardness of that process, is notable. It suggests that the public pressure, which built for a decade after the 2015 Master Framework Agreement went public, actually worked. That's worth noting. Not because the Ford government deserves congratulations for doing something that should have happened in 1995, but because the mechanism, voters getting sufficiently angry about a specific injustice and sustaining that anger long enough to force action, still works, occasionally, when the injustice is visible enough. The beer store was visible enough. The beige building in every strip mall was impossible to ignore. And once people started asking why it existed, the answer was never satisfying. The beer store will not disappear overnight. The recycling infrastructure is genuinely valuable. Some locations will survive by becoming primarily return depots. The organization will adapt, or it will shrink to a rump of its former self, or it will eventually wind down entirely. The honest answer is that the trajectory is clear even if the timeline isn't. What will be gone, what is already effectively gone, is the idea that a foreign-owned consortium has a government-blessed right to control how Ontarians access beer. That idea is dead. It just hasn't finished falling over yet. And that raises a question I want to put directly to you. How many other things in Canadian retail and Canadian policy look normal only because you've never been given a reason to question them? How many other industries operate the way the beer store operated, protected, uncompetitive, extracting value from consumers who had no alternative, because the system has been in place long enough that it looks like furniture? Drop your answer in the comments. Tell me which Canadian monopoly you think is next to crack. And if you're from another province watching Ontario go through this process, if you've been buying beer at a convenience store for 30 years, wondering why Ontario couldn't manage it. I genuinely want to hear what that has looked like from the outside. If this video made you think differently about something you assumed was permanent, give it a like, hit subscribe, and we'll keep pulling at threads that look permanent until they're not. Stay curious.